I started Shareablee because I am a big believer in understanding people's behaviours and their values based on how they actually spend their time. And I was fascinated to hear a lot of what's knowable based on our search activity. And I guess the data set that we'll be talking about now is really all about what we reveal about ourselves in how we connect with other people inside of social networks like Facebook and Instagram, and how that can be used to better understand our audiences and ultimately where the human condition is moving to on a creative level. I started Shareablee because I'm incredibly optimistic about the use cases for this data. As I'm sure everyone knows, there's been some dark spots in terms of how other people have used different sorts of data sets. But leaving that to one side, it is a really, really tough world that marketers and companies and even small businesses find themselves in. So I'm going to start with the bad stuff. At the current churn rate, almost 3/4 of the S&P 500 will be replaced by 2027. And even if this is hyperbole, even if this is half wrong, we're moving into a really, really different time. And you sort of see that in terms of how consumers are empowered to make decisions and how much more ability on each individual person to change their fate, to make informed decisions, to search out the right answers to questions. And many companies that we talk to and that we partner with are really struggling to keep up. And I think a lot of the answers to that lie in the sorts of data sets that are revealed based on how people interact on social. I think that there's a really big misconception that this is just a young person's problem, right? Everyone talks about digital natives and millennials and how disruptive all this is. But the reality is it's a generation of people who feel empowered, who are existing on their mobile devices and want to get the answers to things. And it's really a mindset that's pervasive. I think the first time I saw my 80-year-old mother learn how to make her first Facebook post by herself, and watching her brain plasticity change as she's watching videos. By the way, if anyone ever wants someone to go back and like every single post you've ever made since you started your Facebook account, you can friend my mum. She will literally go back. Like, why are you doing that? It's weird. It's 10 years ago. She's like, it's still a nice picture, But this is not just a millennial or digital native thing. This is something that is absolutely fundamentally shifting how we think about the consumer experience. Just a couple of stats up here. I mean, just in this room, who here sleeps next to a smartphone? Okay, pretty much everyone. I mean, every time I ask, one time I had someone go like on the pillow. I was like, no, it doesn't have to be on the pillow. I'm like, oh yeah, of course. That's where we draw the line. The pillow is too much. But this is pervasive now. This is normal now. There's other stats that say that we check our phones 160 times a day, minimum, right? Like many people would say every hour. 42% of this Generation C is over 40 years old. So there's spending power, there's real momentum, there are families, being crafted around these digital experiences. And the final thing I'll sort of say before we move into some of the specific data is that it used to be that as a brand, highly satisfied was like a really high bar, right? If your customers, I run a technology company, if my customers are highly satisfied, I feel like we're doing a good job. And this kind of goes, no. This actually says you need fully connected consumers and that they're worth 50%, 52% more over the course of their life. So it isn't just enough that people are highly satisfied, they actually need to be a part of the community of your products. And that's a fundamentally different bar. And most advertisers don't know what that means. And I think we're all still, as an industry, trying to understand how to adjust the way that we think about creative and experiences. In terms of the data that we examine and that we'll be sharing a little bit of, we think about the sort of passively observed data that is about the sorts of articles that we read on Facebook or the sorts of videos that we might choose to share, not in your private feed, but in terms of the content from BuzzFeed or HuffPost or any others, just as a huge indicator of consumer connectivity. We think about this a lot in the context of weak signals. And I'll give you an example. A lot of the time, it's not about these big trends that you see emerge on social, but you'll start to see, quite a few years ago, we started to see this emergence of sort of retail influencers who are selling things. And now, of course, it's eating at pretty much every consumer brand category that exists. But these sorts of things, start to emerge before they become really big trends. And that's really sort of capturing all of that is really sort of what we try and understand with our customers. But let's begin with what I mean when I talk about data. So we're going to show a couple of things on charts, but I just want to situate us just so that we're all on the same page. There's kind of two kinds of data. One type, which I believe is sometimes the type that we don't want to use when it comes to the creative process. There was a great question earlier about that, which is the measurement stuff. That's all the stuff with big stats and numbers and counting. And these are the people that come in and tell you that your campaign sucked after the campaign's already run and you can't do anything about it. And that's all the measurement stuff. And then there's the data that can actually be used for ideas and creation. So to springboard new concepts, to gut check, or to back a play that you think you want to move on. I think about both. So the counting is really the how many and the how good, ad effectiveness, how many people saw it. And the ideas and creation are the data sets that ask, who is the consumer, what drives him or her, and what is the context of that experience. And it's that data set that I'm going to be focusing a little more on today, because I think it's at the core of how we can use what we know about people based on their social activities to make better creative and better messages. Having said that, I will share a couple of stats because we do count over 500,000 companies every single day, and I feel compelled to put a couple charts in. So I get a lot of questions about whether social media itself is still growing. And the high-level answer is yes. If you look year over year across Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, we've actually seen just on 20% growth. One thing that you can see is that Instagram continues to eat a bigger and bigger portion of everything that's going on. It used to be that was just driven by retail and beauty brands, but now even television is actually bigger on Instagram than on Facebook, which everyone thought wouldn't happen, but it has. And I think it just speaks to some of the trends that we heard about in the last presentation, which is, consumers are impatient. They want to see images very quickly. They don't have to read a whole lot through stuff and work very hard to get their content. And you're seeing a lot of that play out. Video is actually at the core of everything. Fun fact, I founded Shareablee. So before I started Shareablee, I was building video products with another measurement company called Comscore. And part of the reason why I quit my job was I was just so sick of standing in front of people talking about video and how great video was and how video was driving change. And when I first started Shareablee, everything was about images, right? Everything on social media was photos. And now, of course, video is on the rise. Video is driving everything. But again, it's important because, sight, sound, and motion transforms experiences. And the sorts of videos that I not only passively enjoy watching, but that I enjoy so much and find so important that I'm actually going to share it out to everyone that I have known and loved and sort of recommend it as something that they should spend their time on. It's a pretty high endorsement, and it gives a lot of insight into what I value. There's always the fun considerations on whether I'm sharing things that promote my best self or whether it's purely what I care about. But nevertheless, there's that intent to share things out in that way. This is actually what it looks like if you look at things since 2013. The orange is the amount of engagement that consumers are making with video content. The blue is how much more video content is going out there. And this actually tricks you to think that video content is declining, but it only looks that way because the amount of consumer interactions is so much bigger. So, if you think about that in terms of your own campaigns or how you think about your strategy, if you're doing a little more video, you're getting a whole lot more engagement back compared with how much you're actually putting out there. So it's incredibly important. And then I think the last stat around how to think about numbers. Up the top here was an analysis for Black Friday, which actually looked at sort of, which retailer won social when it came to Black Friday. And up top is looking at all of the fans and followers. You've got kind of Walmart, Amazon, Target, etc., based on how many people have opted in to hear their messages. Now, the guy down the bottom is how many consumers actually reacted or responded to any of those ads or content. So I like to think about the top as the dollars and sort of how much time has spent acquiring people to potentially see your messages, and the bottom is sort of whether they care and whether they resonate. So really kind of keeping your eye on both the potential reach as well as the number of human beings who actually are doing something about that. It's pretty different, right? It's not even remotely correlated. So now talking a little bit about what else can be gettable based on why people share. So I'm, called my company Shareablee, so I'm clearly interested in sharing, and there's not a whole lot of available URLs, let's be honest. But we did a study, there's actually a third wave of our study, around why on earth people share content. And this is not only publishing content, this is ads, this is retail content, this is CPG, and we looked at all of the most shared creative over the course of 6 months, and we've done this 3 times, and then surveyed against different elements in that content. And the 4 things that we looked at was social currency, so stuff that makes me look good or look intelligent, appear in the know, etc. Evoking emotions, both positive and negative, usefulness, as well as telling a story. And just out of the gate, the only thing that sort of disqualified itself was we are not sharing angry or sort of negative content that provokes a negative emotion. The only exception to that, of course, is politics and breaking news. So if there's a lost child or something, we'll share that out. But in general, no one wants to be that person in your newsfeed who's constantly sharing stuff that's going to make people upset and angry. It tends to get people to hide you or unfriend you. Here's what we found. Thankfully, storytelling was still at the core of why we share. It's by far the highest and greatest use for sharing across social media. Social currency was next, and interestingly, this actually shifted a lot. So if you were looking at this chart like 2-3 years ago, the things that had social currency for the average consumer were things that made you look intelligent to others, or appear in the know, or sort of otherwise make yourself look good. But what had shifted in the last sort of 6-9 months was that people actually wanted to share things that made them appear more caring to other people or made them feel like a part of the community. So you do often see a reflection of what's potentially going on in the world and how people like to react and respond. Like if times are a little better, we're a little more focused on ourselves. If times are a little dicier, we tend to want to behave a little more integratively towards the whole of society. Feeling inspired was also a big one, and then emotion. When you actually break this out by gender, it looks quite different. So both genders were unified by a desire to look good to others. In terms of the driving emotion, women were much more driven by messages that, if shared, would make people happy. Men were much more driven by excitement. And if you can imagine this in the context of, beauty messaging or retail or automotive, it was about, for men, it was much more about new releases, exciting information, etc. Women were driven by looking intelligent. Interestingly, it wasn't book smart. It was more about appearing savvy. So I'm sort of intelligent and savvy about shopping or about research. Men were much more motivated by being funny. And the last point was around usefulness, which was actually the most significant driver for women and was not a significant driver at all for men. It was just in the data. I didn't put that together. So who knows, right? And 18 to 24-year-olds found that being in the know was actually their biggest driver. And actually another interesting point, so if you remember this guy, where we said that story was the most important, when we dived into 18 to 24-year-olds, story was actually not even significant at all. And I read this result, and first, we got the result, didn't like it, rechecked it, has to be wrong. Checked it again, wasn't wrong, was right. And I was like, that's it. Society's going to hell in a handbasket. Like, no one young cares about stories anymore. This is terrible. But when we dug into it, what was actually going on was that 18 to 24-year-olds didn't care about content that sort of told a story if there was no way for them to somehow participate in it. So if they couldn't give their opinion or their spin or somehow be a part of the narrative, then it didn't feel like a story that they felt had share-worthiness to them. And also usefulness didn't matter, and appearing caring just didn't matter at all. So. Looking also, inside people's behaviours as expressed by what they share on social media. Here was a couple of sporting goods brands where we looked at the people who had engaged with those brands across different social platforms, and then what else they had engaged with. And we took this in the context of some sports teams. And you'll just see that whereas many times we might think that the audiences for a given shoe or for a given apparel brand are quite similar because maybe demographically they're quite similar. Often when you actually dig into their behaviours, it's really quite different. And I think, thinking of the data sets this way gives us a much better creative springboard to not prejudge the people that we're marketing to, but to actually spend a little bit more time understanding how they spend their time and being a little more thoughtful about the way to present messages to them. It sort of doesn't get us the full way towards personalisation, but I think it certainly brings some different springboards. My anxiety whenever I hear about, data-driven creative is what people are talking about really is data-driven optimization. It's picking two different pieces of creative and using data to tell you which one's better than which. And then my anxiety is like, what if they were both bad, And you're just picking the best of the worst. It's my thesis that I think that springboarding with some data ideas can actually help prevent making the wrong stuff to begin with. It can't make the creative, but it can certainly, put the boards around the idea and give you something to actually to play with. And this is just another example of how, there are certain sort of secrets contained in how people are spending their time on social media. This was an example for a specific hotel brand that was really geared around family travel. So everything in their messaging was around, kids and playgrounds and this and all these like great things to do with your children as a family when traveling. And when they actually dug into who was engaging with their brand on social, it became really clear that it was actually largely sort of affluent businesswomen that were staying with this chain, and that a lot of the posts that were pushing, how great it was that you could do all this stuff with their kids. And the women didn't necessarily not have kids, but they were traveling for business, and the thought of, handling kids and all of that was sort of really quite unappealing. So every time they were posting these beautiful things about these idyllic family landscapes, the women were just going, no, like I left that behind, you've got to actually help me see how I can be successful in business travel. So they identified a completely new segment that they didn't even know was staying with them in that sense, because they'd made these determinations, and when they tested who these women were, they saw that they had families, they assumed it was family travel. And that was just a great insight around that. So coming to the end, I think thinking about social data, not only to measure the sorts of things that you might be posting on an Instagram or a Facebook, but also as clues to learn more about the consumers that you want to reach, I think is incredibly fertile ground. I think that oftentimes when we think about data, we just think about measurement, which is counting stuff and telling us if it was good or bad, and often it just isn't viewed as proactive and instructive. But from my perspective, at least, I think that's one of the biggest opportunities there are, and it's largely untapped because even though many of us are talking about data-driven creativity, I believe that we're still very young in that practice, and there's still tremendous amounts of opportunity to it. So, thank you.